Montana Territory, late spring of 1874. Dust rose in lazy curls from the main street of Helena as the noon sun bore down, hot and bright, on the backs of men who had long since forgotten what peace felt like. Jesse Vaughn dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, face shadowed beneath the brim of his black hat. His coat was worn, his eyes more so. Folks in town knew him as the rancher from Cedar Ridge, some 15 miles west, the one who came to town only when he had to and never stayed longer than needed. He had not planned on staying long today either until he saw her. She stood just off to the side of the saloon, hands folded in front of her, eyes downcast. A man with slicked back hair and a sweat-stained collar stood beside her, holding a slip of paper and talking loud enough for the whole street to hear. "You got 2 weeks left, Fiona O'Dell, or the debt gets sold to the brothel. You think they'll be as patient as I've been?" Fiona said nothing. Jesse had no business getting involved. He told himself that plain and clear. But her silence struck him. It was not fear. It was something else. Resignation. The kind that settled deep in the bones. He stepped forward before he could think better of it. "How much does she owe?" Jesse asked. The man blinked, looked him up and down. "Who's asking?" "Name's Jesse Vaughn." He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and dropped it into the man's hand. "That should cover it." The man opened the pouch. "This is more than enough. Then we're done here." The man gave a half laugh, stepped back, and disappeared into the saloon. Fiona turned toward Jesse, her voice soft. "You should not have done that." "You got somewhere else to be?" he asked. She shook her head. "Well," he said, adjusting his hat, "then come on. I got horses tied out front." Fiona hesitated only a moment before following him. They rode west, away from the noise and stench of town, into the open land where the air smelled clean and the grass stretched to the mountains. Jesse's ranch sat at the base of a low ridge, his house a simple cedar structure with a wraparound porch and a windmill creaking in the distance. He helped her down from her horse, then gestured toward the house. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said. "You are not in anyone's debt, not anymore." She looked up at him, eyes cautious. "Why would you help me?" Jesse looked off toward the hills. "Because I know what it feels like to carry something alone for too long." Fiona said nothing to that. But that night, after he showed her the spare room and set a plate of stew on the table, she sat across from him and quietly took his hand. "Thank you," she said. He only nodded. The days passed slowly. Fiona took to the ranch like she had been born to it. She helped in the kitchen, cleaned the barn, fed the chickens, and never once asked for more than she needed. She did not talk much, but Jesse found he did not mind the quiet. It was a peaceful kind. Not the kind that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. She had a way of sitting on the porch in the evenings, hands folded in her lap, eyes on the horizon. Jesse found himself watching her more often than he meant to. One morning, as he saddled his horse, she stepped beside him. "You going into town?" she asked. "Just to pick up some supplies." "I'll come." He paused, then nodded. The ride into Helena was quiet but not strained. They stopped at the general store, spoke little, and were nearly ready to leave when a small voice called out from the alley behind the mercantile. "Miss Fiona." A boy, maybe 7 or 8, ran toward them, his face smudged with dirt, his clothes torn. He flung his arms around her waist. "Caleb," Fiona whispered, arms tightening around him. "What are you doing here?" I came looking. They said you were gone." "That man said you left." Jesse watched, stunned, as Fiona knelt down and pulled the boy close. "This is your son?" he asked. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "He is not mine by blood, but I raised him, and his sister." "Where's your sister?" Jesse asked the boy. Caleb looked down. "They took her. Said I was too old to be worth much. But Clara, she's only 5. Fiona stood, her jaw set. "Where?" "Other side of town. The brothel." Jesse did not wait. "Get on your horse. Both of you." Fiona helped Caleb up, hands shaking. They rode fast, Jesse at the front, his revolver already loaded. He knew the place, knew the woman who ran it. He had no patience for her or the men she hired. They kicked in the door without warning. Clara was in the back room, curled up beneath a blanket, crying. Jesse carried her out himself. He paid the woman off with the last of the gold he kept hidden beneath the floorboards of his barn, and swore he would burn the place to the ground if she ever touched another child. Back on the ranch, Caleb and Clara slept in the spare room, curled up together like they had not been apart a day. Fiona stood on the porch, arms folded. "You did not have to help," she said, voice thick. Jesse stepped beside her. "Yes, I did." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because maybe helping you. Maybe it fixes a little of what broke in me." Fiona reached for his hand again. This time he held it. The wind had shifted by June, bringing with it the scent of wild lupin and the low murmur of bees in the ryegrass. Jesse had taken to waking before first light, not out of necessity, but because he liked the quiet. The kind that came before the day stirred before the chickens started fussing and the stove was lit. He'd sit on the porch with coffee gone lukewarm, watching the pale horizon brighten behind the ridge. Fiona joined him that morning without a word, wrapped in her shawl, hair still damp from the basin. She didn't ask for coffee. She just sat beside him and kept her hands in her lap. "When we were in town," she said after a long pause, "that man who held my debt, his name's Parrish. He used to own cotton land in Georgia. Lost it after the war. Now he trades people instead." Jesse didn't respond right away, his jaw tightening slightly. "You worried he'll come out this way?" he asked finally. "No," she said. "He likes soft targets. He'll move on." They sat in silence until the sun crested the ridge. Then Clara cried from inside, and Fiona rose to tend to her. Jesse watched her go, the shawl slipping from one shoulder as she stepped through the door. Later that week, they hitched up the wagon and drove north along the creek trail to check the far pasture. Caleb sat in the back, a slingshot in hand and a crow feather stuck behind his ear. Clara held a cloth doll Fiona had sewn from an old flour sack, her thumb in her mouth. Fiona sat beside Jesse, skirt tucked tight under her legs, her posture straight despite the jostle of the road. "You always work this land alone?" she asked. "Since my brother passed," he said. "He ran the south end. I took over both sides when the fever came through." She glanced at him, then out across the grazing hills. "My mother died of fever in Missouri. I was 12. After that, it was just my father and me. He traded horses mostly. When he drank, he'd say I was the reason he never got to leave." Jesse kept his eyes on the trail. "And when you left?" "I didn't tell him. I just took the train west. Couldn't keep waiting for things to get better." That night, while the children slept, Fiona stood outside the barn watching the moon rise over the ridge. Jesse came up behind her, carrying a blanket in one hand and draped it over her shoulders without asking. "You ever think about leaving again?" he asked. "I did. When you first brought me here, I thought I'd stay a few weeks at most. Then find work in Missoula or somewhere. And now?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable in the low light. "I've been waiting a long time to feel useful again. To feel safe. I didn't expect it to be here." Jesse leaned against the post beside her. "You've done more in a few weeks than I managed in a year," he said. "This place feels different now. Less empty." Fiona turned slightly toward him. "I see how you were with them with Caleb and Clara. You don't speak much, but they lean into you like they've known you longer than I have. They don't look at me like I'm broken," he said, voice low. "Most folks do." She stepped closer, her fingers brushing his sleeve. "You're not broken. You're just tired of carrying things alone." He looked down at her hand, then back at her eyes. "You can stay," he said, barely above a whisper. "As long as you want. Longer, if you'll let me hope for that." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she took his hand and held it in both of hers, warm and steady. The barn horses shifted behind them, but the night was otherwise quiet. A soft breeze stirred the grass, and above them, the stars came out, one by one. The wheatgrass had grown tall enough by mid-June to rustle against the hem of Fiona's skirt when she walked the edge of the south pasture. She had taken to waking early and walking the land before the children stirred. Clara still thumb-sucking in sleep. Caleb curled around his pillow like he'd been holding on through a storm. Jesse had offered to watch them in the mornings, and to her surprise, he'd taken the role seriously, quietly reading the boy bits of last year's almanac or showing Clara how to hold a chick without squeezing. That morning, she found Jesse near the fence line, his shirt damp from hauling feed. He paused when he saw her, hand resting on the post he'd just reset. "You think they'd take to schooling?" she asked, shielding her eyes with her hand. He straightened, squinting against the low sun. "There's a woman out west near Avon. Teaches out of her parlor. I could ride out next week, see if she's still taking young ones." Fiona picked at the thread of her sleeve. "Clara's quick with her letters. Caleb's slower, but he listens close." Jesse wiped his hands on his trousers and looked past her to where the barn's shadow stretched long across the dry grass. "I could build something here. A place for them to learn if Avon don't work." She stepped closer, her voice low. "You'd build a schoolhouse?" "Not much more than a shed with benches," he said. "But I'd rather not send them off if we don't have to." Fiona's throat tightened. She wasn't used to a man asking what her children needed, much less offering before she did. She kept her voice level. "They've never had a place where they were expected to stay." Jesse looked at her then. Really looked. "Neither have I." That evening, thunderheads gathered in the south, and Jesse brought the horses in early. Caleb helped, careful but still clumsy, while Clara followed Fiona around the kitchen, handing her spoons, then forgetting what she was supposed to do and drifting to the window. As the rain started, soft at first, Jesse leaned in the doorway watching Fiona knead dough at the table. She moved with quiet precision, her hair pinned back but loosened by the heat. He didn't speak until she looked up. "You ever think about marrying again?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "I never married before." He frowned. "I thought they called me his woman. But there was no preacher, no paper. Just years and no way out." Jesse stepped inside. The rain picked up, drumming on the roof. "I ask because I've been thinking," he said. "Not just about you and me, but about what kind of life we could make." Fiona pressed her palm flat against the dough. "You think children and land and a quiet kitchen mean peace. I think they mean something worth holding on to." She looked down at her hands. "I've never had a man ask me, not without expecting something in return." "I'm not asking it," he said gently. "I'm saying I'm ready if you ever want to." She turned then, slowly, and crossed the room until there was nothing between them but the weight of that storm outside. "I'd want it to be mine this time," she said. "Not something I'm dragged into." "You'd have my name, but not my shadow," Jesse said. "I'd give you space, not chains." Fiona reached up, fingers brushing his jaw, and for the first time she smiled, not polite, not cautious, but like something inside her had finally loosened its grip. "You're not what I expected," she whispered. He covered her hand with his. "You're exactly what I hoped I'd find, though I never thought I would." Outside, the rain softened to a hush. Inside, the warmth between them deepened, not rushed, not uncertain. Just steady, like the earth after a long, dry spell, ready at last to bloom. By the time July settled into the valley, Jesse had begun clearing the old sheep pen to make space for a small schoolhouse. He didn't have blueprints or measurements, just a plan sketched out in his head and the steady rhythm of labor he'd known since boyhood. Fiona brought him water in the midday heat, her sleeves rolled, a wet cloth tucked beneath her collarbone to keep the sun off her neck. One afternoon, while Clara napped and Caleb picked thistle burrs from the goat's tail, Fiona stood beside Jesse as he drove the final post into place. "You build like a man who doesn't expect help," she said, brushing sawdust from her palm. "Been that way a long time." She leaned against the fence rail, her voice quiet but sure. "You don't have to keep proving you can carry everything alone." He looked at her, the blunt end of the mallet still in his hand. "I'm not sure I'd know how to stop." "Then let me show you." That evening, after supper, Fiona didn't reach for the dishes. Instead, she sat down opposite him at the table, the oil lamp casting amber light across her face. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you asked." He set his fork down. He didn't speak, just waited. "I'd want the marriage to be real. Not just for the children. Not just because it's easier for neighbors to make sense of us that way. I wouldn't ask it any other way. I want to take your name, she said. But I want a voice in how we build this life. Jesse's eyes softened. You've had that since the day I rode you out of town. She reached for his hand across the table. Then I'd say yes. They married at the edge of the creek, under a cottonwood that split near the base and fanned out like a blessing. Caleb stood solemn with a wildflower tucked behind one ear, and Clara clutched Fiona's hand until the preacher finished the words. Fiona wore a dress stitched from muslin she'd bartered for in Avon, and Jesse stood in his best shirt, collar stiff and unfamiliar. When it came time to kiss her, he hesitated a moment, not from doubt, but from reverence. Then he cupped her face in his work-worn hands and kissed her like he'd been holding his breath since the war ended. Afterward, they laid a blanket near the creek and watched the children chase frogs through the reeds. Fiona leaned into Jesse's side, her cheek against his shoulder. My mother had a garden, she said. Used to say a woman should always plant something when she puts down roots. He turned his head slightly. What would you plant? Beans, maybe? Or sweet corn? She smiled faintly. Something that climbs. Jesse took her hand, traced the inside of her wrist with his thumb. We'll fence off a patch behind the barn. You can plant anything you want. That night, when the house had quieted and the children slept, Jesse and Fiona lay beside each other in the narrow bed, the window open to let in the cool breath of the hills. He reached for her, not out of hunger but need, the quiet kind that asked nothing but presence. She turned to him, eyes steady. I'm not afraid anymore. He brushed her hair back, his voice low. Neither am I. And when they came together, it wasn't about forgetting what had come before, but about finally crossing into something new. Something they could name and tend and keep. Just like she said, something that could climb. August came in dry and bright, the grass thinning to gold and the river running low between its banks. Jesse rose early to finish the roof on the schoolhouse. The last beams lifted with Caleb's small hands steadying the ladder, and Fiona standing below with Clara balanced on one hip and a jug of buttermilk in the other. By mid-month, the schoolhouse stood finished, a modest, one-room structure with 2 windows facing east and a narrow porch where Fiona had placed a bench. She'd lined the inside with bundles of pressed wildflowers and pages of letters she copied by hand in neat rows for the children to trace. They invited neighbors from as far as 20 miles for a gathering to mark the first day of lessons. Wagons arrived in the warm light of late morning, carrying families with dust on their boots and pie tins wrapped in cloth. Jesse smoked meat over hickory while Fiona poured cider from a barrel she'd traded for with fresh preserves and dried herbs. As the adults gathered under the shade of cottonwoods, the children spilled into the clearing, chasing each other between fence rails and calling out names with the ease of those who've never learned to hide their joy. Fiona stood near the doorway, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, watching Clara show a younger girl how to draw a butterfly in the dirt with a stick. Jesse came beside her, brushing wood shavings from his sleeve. That bench yours? He asked, nodding toward the porch. I carved it from the old hayrack, she said. Figured it had one good use left in it. He leaned slightly toward her. You've done more with this place in 2 months than I managed in years. She didn't answer right away, her gaze tracking Caleb as he tossed a ball toward a boy from a nearby homestead. I didn't know a place could feel like something you earned, she said. Not just something you survived. Later, after the guests had gone and the last of the pie had been packed away, Jesse found Fiona in the barn, brushing down the mule. Her sleeves were rolled, her braid loose from the long day. I was thinking, he said, leaning against the stall. We could fence off the north slope come September. Give the goats more room. She glanced over, her hand moving steady down the animal's flank. You planning on staying busy all winter? Not if I can help it, he said. I'd rather be inside, warming the kitchen, helping with lessons. Maybe carving a cradle. She froze, the brush stilled in her hand. He stepped closer, his voice low. If you are. Fiona set the brush down gently, then turned to face him. I wondered when you'd ask. He reached for her, his hand settling on her waist. You already knew? I did. She smiled with her whole face, the lines around her eyes soft. I didn't say anything because I wanted to be sure this life, this quiet wasn't temporary. It's not, Jesse said. I'm not. That night, as the lantern burned low and the children slept in their beds with the windows open to the sound of crickets, Jesse and Fiona lay together with her head tucked beneath his chin and his fingers brushing slow across her back. I never thought I'd get this, he said. Not after the things I've seen. The things I lost. You didn't lose everything, she whispered. No, he said. I found something better. She pressed a kiss to his collarbone, her breath warm against his skin. You found us. Time moved gently after that. The schoolhouse filled each morning with the sounds of chalk and laughter. Fiona taught letters and numbers, while Jesse taught carpentry and patience. Caleb took to reading stories aloud, and Clara braided wildflowers into the porch railings. In winter, they kept a fire burning through the night and listened to the wind against the siding. Jesse built a cradle from pine and lined it with wool. Fiona sewed tiny mittens and told Clara stories of brave girls who crossed rivers and made homes of their own. The baby came in early spring, born in the quiet hours before dawn. Fiona held her with a look Jesse had never seen on her face before, one of peace, so deep it silenced the world. They named her Maeve after Fiona's grandmother, and she had Jesse's eyes and Fiona's mouth. Neighbors came with gifts, a quilt, a carved rattle, a basket of dried apples. Life settled around them like a well-worn coat, familiar, warm, and finally theirs. On the first morning warm enough to shed their coats, Jesse stood on the porch with Maeve in his arms. Fiona came up beside him, her hand slipping into his without hesitation. He looked out at the land, the schoolhouse, the fields greening again, the children racing toward the creek, and then at her. You think this is what peace feels like? He asked. She leaned her head on his shoulder. No, she said. Peace was quieter than this. This is better. This is joy. He kissed her temple, slow and sure. And there, with the sun rising over the ridge and spring blooming at their feet, Jesse and Fiona stood together, husband and wife, father and mother, builder and teacher, rooted deep in the land, in each other, and in a life wholly earned.